What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Chapter 5 of the Modern Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Mahfouz Chowdhury. I'm here with my incredible host, Camille. We're here back for week 5 of this incredible podcast show that we've been starting. And, today's a special day for a couple of reasons, Camille. First and foremost, I was very nicely woken up with a notification from my Spotify account that after much delay and much anticipation, the Kanye West album Donda has finally been released, and I very much blocked out the rest of my evening today to just sit down with headphones on in a very quiet, dark space, potentially shedding tears, and I'm really excited to jam with that album. And it got me thinking: is like, does everyone have a ritual when that thing comes out, that thing that you're excited about? I imagine that there's artists that you get really excited about when you see an album release. To me, it's artists like Kanye West, it's The Weeknd, it's Drake. When their album comes out, I have a ritual. There's something that I do that day to give myself the space to really take in the album. What is your ritual? Like, what do you do when that album comes out and you get really pumped about it?
Most of the time I don't know that it's coming out, and it just sort of surprises me. Like YouTube algorithm will know which artists I like, and then I just get excited and then just listen to it. So for the most part, I don't have a ritual for, let's say, like album releases, just because of the surprise factor. I i think for things that I do anticipate coming out, when they do, I just like to set some time aside for it, and depending on whether or not like it's a solo thing or a group, like one where, like, for example, like going to a comedy club or anything like that, then it's different. If it's with a group, I like to meet up with them before, hype it up more, and then go.
Yeah, man, it's to me, it's like I need to understand how to take something in for the first time, right? Because you kind of like miss that feeling when you go back to your favorite songs where you actually don't know what the artist is about to say, and you actually listen to the way that they enunciate those words. When it's like a line that hits and they say it in a very high emphasis, very very sarcastic type tone that Kanye West is known for, is like it feels different. But when you memorize those lyrics on the road, you almost ignore that amount of effort that he puts in to get to deliver that line. My ritual is kind of it's very much like I need to make space, as you said, give yourself the time to really sit down and take it in without disruption. That first time I listen an album through from beginning to end with no judgment, there may be songs that I'm like, ooh, this one is kind of nice, I got to come back to this one. Or ones that you're like, okay, it's not great, but I'll listen to it because I owe it that much, and maybe there's something out of it that'll come out. But then, like, over time, you just always you become that annoying friend that you always have it playing in your car every time someone gets in. They're like, oh, this album again, until you get obsessed, and then until you get sick of it. Like, it's a little bit of a cycle that I go through to really take it in. But I'm excited. I've started my day off with listening to a couple of tracks that I've, again, the feeling of never listening to it before. It gets really really exciting. So happy Donda Day to many of you that are listening to it. And if you're streaming this instead of listening to the album, like, you've become our best friends. You are the real MVP, because I think we can all agree there's far more value in the Modern Mindset podcast than in the Donda album. I truly believe that. But the other reason why this day is very important is I just saw the announcement the other day on the Modern Mindset Instagram account, and it stated that we have officially been recording for more than 1 month. Over a month ago, Camille, you and I sat down and we made the decision. We were both on Amazon.ca together, figuring out which microphone to purchase, and we both bought the microphone at the same time. And since then, I actually went back and did the math, and we have recorded over 7 hours and 48 minutes of content over the last 4 weeks alone. And that to me was wild. Almost 8 hours worth of content over the last 4 weeks, which, you think about people that record even 1 hour or less episode a week, like that's 8 episodes for them or more for majority of people. How does that feel? Like, how has your 1 month experience been over those 7 hours and 48 minutes of content that we've been putting out?
Yeah, it's amazing to think about it like that, because it's more, I think about each segment as like, a separate thing. So it's like we've done four and this is our fifth. And then to think that it's like, 7 hours, that's like it's a great feeling, and especially knowing that it's been a month as well. It really puts that timestamp really does help uh, make me feel more appreciative that we've gone like this far, and this is our first milestone, and there's many more to look forward to. But it's nice to see that there is like a quantity that we can actually express.
Yeah, those metrics are quite special. And for those of you that have been listening and following along, we can't tell you enough how much it means to us and matters to us. I mean, your attention is our fuel, your feedback is our oxygen, and it's your willingness to really take in our value that makes us come back every single week. I've been very intentional, Camille, of like not looking at any of the metrics. I've been very intentional of staying away from the stats because I never want the metrics to be what skews our direction of this podcast show. For example, we might have put out 4 episodes. We go back and we see that there was one topic that got more attention than the others. All of a sudden, there'll be a part of our mind that's subconsciously telling us to dig into that topic a little bit more. And there's value in that, right? Like there's value in that, saying the audience wants to know about this a bit more, but at the same time, we're still too early in the phase, I believe. I think we're still laying down the foundation of every pillar of what this podcast represents. That by getting skewed too early, we're also doing we're also creating a disservice for the audience, where they could have benefited from the other topics as well, but we chose not to dive into those as well. But this, I think, does a fantastic job into getting into our conversation and topic of the day, which is we really want to dive in around the idea of better awareness. And better awareness is something that I think can be tackled in many ways, specifically on the self-awareness side. And metrics, for example, is a great way for you to know whether or not you are on the right track and doing the right things, or you also get to learn how to modify your way of doing things based on that. So to me, there's a level of awareness that's required not only in the things that you're doing, but also who you're becoming. And I think that it's very difficult sometimes to keep track of who you're becoming because it's not as tangible with the numbers and the results that you're pulling out. It's not as easy to be able to look back at it and being like, am I doing things that are incorrect? Am I aware of the things that I'm doing? And it's not always the case, is it?
No, I don't think so. Like for me, I always assume that I'm very good at being intuitive about like what's making me unhappy or eating my time. But it is important also to be like hold yourself accountable and actually see what you're doing and maybe even measure it in a way that you can actually look back later and reflect on it, and that way you can be aware that hey, maybe this is eating up your time too much, or that this thing that you're focusing on is making you unhappy, or that you're hyper focusing and you're neglecting other things. For instance, I tend to neglect the things that make me happy or that re-energize me, and when I do that, I notice that my performance suffers in every other aspect. So it's kind of strange that I want to optimize my performance, but I do that by neglecting the thing that gives me that recharge. So sometimes it's very important to have those measurements, to have those metrics, as you pointed out. I feel like with me too is the most beneficial information for me is when I actually have those negative emotions and I sit with them and I like think about what am I doing. And I've had so many times in my life too where I realize that I don't know why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, and then that comes from the reflection piece. However, I've also I also struggled a lot with being even aware that I'm in a bad place. So I had like a couple techniques to actually be like, okay, I'm not doing so good now, or I can feel myself declining. And then if you can feel yourself declining and you can prevent it from actually like hitting a slump, then that's the best way. I think they say like an ounce prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I strongly believe that, and I hold that in regard to almost everything I do. So it's very important to be aware of those things. And, having those metrics works very well for most people. And that intuitive thinking sometimes can be counterintuitive, right? Because, especially what I learned in archery is that um, everyone tells you to listen to your body. But in archery, your body lies to you. So you have to actually be very, very conscious of everything you do and actually kind of force force your body in the way that you need to do to aim at the right goal, to actually hold yourself in place as you release the arrow from the bow. Because if you do it too quick and if you look at the end result and not at what you're doing at this moment, then it shifts. Even if for the second when you release that arrow and you look up, it goes up too high. So it's very important to be aware of what you're doing and to stay with that. And that extends being to looking at how you're focusing your time, because anything you pay attention to will grow. And if you're focusing on the things that don't make you happy or the things that aren't serving you well, then you're naturally going to become more unhappy and more unfulfilled.
I really love the idea of using sports as the ideal analogy to break down how to go from that conscious way of thinking first and being aware of every part of that process, right down to the unconscious way of being able to execute it without even putting any thought towards it. And I think that gets really, really fun. I believe you used it as an example in a past chapter with basketball as well, right? When you're shooting the ball, you at the very beginning put a lot of thought behind the perfect way to hold the ball, the perfect release, the perfect amount of strength, where to stand, how to position your feet, how to follow through after, where your finger points after you release. But you do it long enough, you get into that autopilot mode. But sometimes that autopilot mode could work against you if you were doing it wrong the entire time, right? And sometimes you you may be able to increase it from a 10% to a 15%, but the reality is if you did it correctly, you would have already been shooting at 25%, right? And the thing is, like, you don't realize that, but because your incorrect way is showing some sort of improvement, you start all of a sudden believing that it's the right thing to do. And our relationship goes way back, Camille, and because our relationship goes way back, you and I know that we've both kind of suffered with being in an environment where we weren't aware that there were things that were going wrong. And sometimes it came down to the fact that we didn't take enough time to listen to our body or reflect on the things that we experienced to figure out if there's anything wrong. Mine specifically, and I think yours may as well, is in sometimes in relationships that you're part of. And I've been part of relationships where there just wasn't there just wasn't that level of awareness for me to realize at that moment that I wasn't in a very healthy relationship. And I've gone through it. And sometimes you have challenges in the relationship and you think that it's just a challenge, it'll pass, or everybody's going through it. This is a commonality in relationships. So all of a sudden you're starting to kind of let it happen more than you have. And it to me, that actually terrifies me. It terrifies me to think about how often you could be standing in the fire and not feeling the heat and not realizing that you're actually like deteriorating away every single day. Relationships is a good example. Another one was just when I have unhealthy habits and I don't realize it because no one in the world is really coming up and telling you that, hey, you're really dropping the ball. Your friends, to their credit, they're your friends. So even if you're being unhealthy or doing unhealthy things, sometimes your friends won't even make you aware of that because they have those the goggles on that makes them see you as still just a friend, and they overlook a lot of those things that might have been considered unhealthy habits. So for a very long time, that autopilot inside of me was making a lot of bad decisions, and I've allowed it to do so because I wasn't aware that something was wrong. Now, as unfortunate as some of those rock bottom moments, for example, a relationship ends, as unfortunate as that feels at that moment, it does give you that wake up call and the slap in the face that makes you reassess what the hell's been going on. You're almost forced to sit down and think about all the things that happened that led to the demise of that relationship. And along the way, as you start paying attention to that demise, that journey that led to rock bottom, you start picking up on things that you're like, whoa, maybe I should have been aware of this, or maybe I should have been better at that, or maybe I should have taken care of myself here and here. And you start realizing some of these things. What I get excited about is the fact that you don't have to wait for rock bottom. You don't have to wait for a demise for you to start making those assessments. And we talked about smelling the roses many times in the show. Stop and smell the roses. And sometimes people see that as a misconception of stop and enjoy the moment. And there is that element in the stop and smell the roses side. But there's the other element that I strongly believe in is just stop and look around. Stop and see what's happening. And, it wasn't only until this year that I started introducing practices like meditation that gives me the opening and the time and the commitment to start looking at my life from a paused environment, not seeing it on the fly. Because I think what a lot of us are doing, Camille, is I think we're all jumping out of a plane without a parachute, and we're trying to build a parachute while we're falling. Where I think there's a lot of opportunity to build that parachute ahead of time and really assess the danger that you're jumping into so that you know exactly what to do when you're there.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it goes back to us talking about what to look for when you're starting like a new habit or activity, and to assess whether or not it can be harmful. You really have to look at the harms for it. But again, if you hyper focus on it, especially like in the context of a relationship, then it's very easy to get terrified and run away from it and avoid them as well. So it's like you have to assess whether or not this is what you want, and also what can you do to kind of prevent these problems, because everyone talks about communication in relationships as well, but it's very difficult to actually put it in practice. I mean, not a lot of people want to talk about that they have certain issues that they're working on, and that they kind of have to support, and they need support in that aspect or in that area. And especially in when you're relying on external variable like another human being, and then on top of that, the the experience that you both share, that you're trying to combine essentially two worlds together and see what happens, then there's all sorts of variables and confusion, and it's always different, but it's almost the same at least. Like the processes are the same. It's just the outcomes seem different, or at least the variables within them are different because again, two unique experiences. So I kind of struggle to say that in that context, I kind of like the idea of jumping in without a parachute and then seeing what happens, and then building one while you're falling. But again, if you're not careful, like you say, you can just hit rock bottom or get really hurt. So I think the awareness piece what comes from being able to know yourself and know those patterns. So when you do jump off, you don't jump out necessarily without a parachute. It's just you kind of embrace the fall. So you're at least you're in the right like position or in the right posture when you're falling, because you remember in skydiving you have to assume I can't remember the position, but your hips forward and then your knees or your lower limbs up a bit. So at least you can do that instead of like falling in like on your back and just hoping for the best. So it seems kind of contradictory, but there is something about embracing the experience, but not going in unconsciously. Like to be very intentional about how you enter it, even when you surrender yourself completely to it, because everyone has their unconscious processes that influence how they behave within that experience. And if you can't allow yourself to experience it, or you can't allow yourself to be to understand that you have certain limits when you for experiences, then it becomes harmful. So in my opinion, it is very difficult to differentiate the two, and obviously it's context dependent, like we always talk about.
Well, this is where we really dive into the component of the long-term part of the story, right? Because on the short term, I mean, I'm all for jumping in and embracing experiences, and especially when you really are feeling the desire to participate in that experience, be it a relationship or something new, it gets really exciting. And this could be relationships, this could be someone that's starting a new venture or a business that feels that excitement of getting it going. And the excitement will do its part. And if you really worked on yourself, you're going to do it well, and you're going to do it for in all the right ways that you believe it's supposed to happen, because at the very beginning you're leading in with that optimism and positivity. But when it comes to a long-term experience, this is where it's very important to sometimes be aware and take off those blinders, right? It's you get comfortable when you do something for a long period of time, especially when you find something that's working. Very rarely do you see yourself modifying something that's working, because you're seeing progress. And even if it's slow progress, it's enough to justify doing it the same way every step of the way. But what if you didn't know that that progress and that method wasn't the right way? Or what if there could have been a better way to do it, but because you didn't take a step back, you didn't give yourself an opportunity to do it? Let's dive into each one of these, because there's a few different things we can talk about here. The first one, being that we're talking about relationships, is yes, there is that part in the relationships where you could feel like things are going well. But we also know that if you get too comfortable and you start having too much of a routine, it kind of takes away a big part of the thrill of what that relationship is. And if you don't give yourself the opportunity to think about how to keep thriving in that relationship and not just staying stagnant, I think that relationship will eventually just work itself down to the ground. I think that doesn't mean being consistency and routines are very different. And I think that needs to be stated. So I think that awareness is what allows you to take those blinders off and reassess the situation and see if there's better ways to do things. And don't get me wrong, this isn't about trying to find holes in the relationship. This is about thriving. This is about being proactive and thinking about how to make it better. I was in relationships in the past that, yeah, I said very heavily that I want our podcast to be very personal and real stories. So I'm going to try to get as real here as I can. I've had a past relationship where it was very toxic, based on the fact that there was a lot of self-conscious behavior, a lot of sensitivity, a lot of jealousy, and a lot of arguments that would build out of the smallest things and then would drag on to multiple days. And for a very long time, that those seemed like things that were normal, or those were things that for some reason your mind thought, hey, eventually it will stop. Just let it go, let it go. And you don't realize that what's happening over a long period of time is that there's dust that's settling, and you're letting the dust settle, and you're like, hey, no problem, let's move to the next thing. We'll get over it. And then the dust settles again, and then it builds up and it builds up, and somewhere down the road it's just so dusty. There's just so much crap in that relationship that it's just almost impossible to clean up, because there's so much to go through. And unfortunately, because you've let the time pass, it's hard to go back and really define the core problem. So now you're putting out your thoughts on your perspective, they're putting out their thoughts on their perspectives, and there's really, as much as it's always impossible to really know the truth, it's even harder when you're revisiting it at a later time, because there's a lot of lost memory. So I think that there's components that if you let things drag on and don't attack it right at the well, you're really going to see a lot of lost opportunities to get it right. And later down the road, it becomes very, very difficult. On the other side, there's opportunities to thrive. You both see that you have desires in your life, in a healthy relationship. You see the opportunity where both of you want to achieve something, and you both know that what you're doing right now isn't getting you there, but there's a lot of potential with just a few good conversations that you could make that happen. Not having that awareness will make you unaware to the fact that that relationship isn't thriving as well as it could have. And it could be conversations with yourself or with a significant other, but not having that awareness is another lost opportunity to do things better. Since I've been in my relationship is about to hit 11 months. And over the last 11 months, we have changed so many things in our relationship, not because we saw them as problems, but rather we saw them as opportunities. We saw them as, hey, if we start implementing this into our life, we can start doing better. One great example is that the both of us started sharing an Audible account, and we both listen to the same audiobooks, and that gives us a great opportunity for us to actually talk about that book and talk about how to bring it to our lives. For me personally, Camille, like when I listen to a book, I learn things, but when I really learn things is when I discuss it with someone else, as you know, because I love discussing things from books with you all the time. And for me to have that with my partner is extravagant. Like it's incredible that both of us can work on our personal development and we get to do it. And now we have this fun thing where every month where we get a free token, it's like, hey, it's your turn to decide which book do you want. And she'll talk about it. And then it'll be like my turn to decide. And I'll say, this is what I've been wanting to try. So we're both kind of tasting each other's where we see the most value, but we're also picking it in a way that we think will better each other towards our desires. So there's that defensive and being proactive on putting out the fires, and then there's about being proactive about growing your wings. And I think you have the ability to do both if you have that level of awareness.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where it comes from too. I mean, you talk about shared experiences and like making the relationship thrive through having a mutual kind of experience that also, well, both parties enjoy, but also both parties can benefit from. And essentially, it has a third dimension, which is the shared experience that you have also grows because those personal development books also include growing together, and since you're growing, you're using the same lessons and and then discussing how to apply those lessons together in a way that both of you can benefit from, then essentially you're growing together. And I think that's like the perfect relationship, is that you both can grow and growing together to become even better than when you first started. And like to me, like I'm excited to hear that you have that, because I think that's amazing, and that's something that I look for myself. Another aspect I like to point out too is like recognizing your defense mechanisms in a relationship when it comes to arguments. If you can be proactive about that, and if you could be honest about it, then that can prevent problems. And also, if there is a lot of people have been talking about the love languages recently. So the words of affirmation, the physical touch, quality time, acts of service, and the gifts. And for a lot of people, I think that can be a very good idea to talk about. Like if someone has a particular desire or need for more of one thing than the other, then it's important to talk about how to manage that. And that will cause the relationship to thrive, because you're essentially working with the person's needs. So if someone needs more physical touch, then that's their thing. But if it conflicts with yours, you have to find some kind of healthy medium. So that can also prevent future problems. And when I go back to the self defense mechanism part of the argument and of what can cause issues in the relationship, because I think that's the most important in my experience as well. As I was also in a toxic relationship, unfortunately, where we would talk about effective communication and how to better communicate, and during arguments it was very hard to remind each other about that. And even though we tried to remind each other about that, and we had the mindset of no one wins an argument, it's about, even if you win the argument, the other person loses, and you both lose because one person won. It's about coming together and understanding what's going on and how to overcome it. So it's about, when it comes to me and my partner, it's about us winning the argument, not about me, not about her winning the argument. And it's really good in theory. It's very difficult to apply in practice, and especially when there has been so much built up resentment that sometimes that person just wants that win, or sometimes I just want that win because I feel like I've already given so much and gotten almost nothing in return, and I let that resentment build up through my lack of communication or through the lack of what I deem to be adequate compromise. That becomes an issue. And I refer our listeners to listen to Gottman's Four Dark Horsemen of Relationships, and because he had an interesting experiment where he brought couples to a bed and breakfast, and he would be able to determine whether or not those couples would stay together. I can't remember the time duration afterwards, but he was above 80% successful in his predictions. And what he did is he mic'd up those. It's actually quite crazy. He mic'd up the couples and he put them on heart rate monitors and stuff. So he could actually hear what they're talking about, and he can see their heart rate rises. And the worst part was the resentment issue, where people would increase. One couple in particular, there was one couple I think that he referenced in one of his talks where someone pointed out that there was a blue jay outside, and the woman did, and the husband, he had an elevation of heart rate, but he just ignored her. And what that was is that buildup of there's something I want to discuss, but I'm not going to discuss, and I'm not even gonna gonna reciprocate your vie into our communication, which was heard, just expressing something. And that's one of the worst things you can do is when someone says something in a relationship or wants to, express or report something, and you ignore it, is what he says is one of the worst signs that the relationship is going to fall apart.
And that is incredible and super valuable. Can you repeat one more time? What is that book that's worth reading?
Um, I'm not sure if he made it into a book, but his I don't remember his first name. He's Gottman, Gottman. So Gottman's Four Dark Horsemen of Relationships.
Such a valuable insight, and I love your perspective on the fact that no one really wins that relation in that argument. Even if you think you won, you still lost in the long term, and I think that's valid. I want to dive into this a little bit more, and mainly because for selfish reasons, because it's definitely something I've struggled a lot with, which is the awareness in the midst of that argument, right? When things are heated and there is heavy disagreements that are happening, and you're trying to kind of figure out how to bring the core beliefs that you subscribe to. Kind of like when you have a retrospective meeting in your head after an argument, you're like, man, I should have done this. I got to do this better, and so forth. But then you kind of have that same fight or flight mode that turns on in the middle of the next argument. You're kind of on autopilot, and that animal inside of you kind of takes over. What have you seen or done that allows you to bring that logic back inside of your head, that does make you aware, like where you get to actually go back to that conversation you had where you said, this time I said I was going to do it better? Have you had an experience with that, and how have you navigated towards that?
Oh, yeah, I've had because of that toxic relationship in particular. I had a hard time throughout my life actually accessing my anger. Like it came up in other ways, uh, but the one good lesson that relationship gave me was being able to access it. And because I suppressed it for so long, to actually feel it for the first time, it was such a huge shift that I almost can logically, well, it would take over, don't get me wrong, but as a result, it was exhausting. And it's hilarious where I'm almost like, I want to almost raise my voice, and then I'm like, and I'm angry, but then there was this voice that said, I'm tired. Like this is costing a lot of energy, and I don't want to use any more energy. So I think the main technique though was first of all being aware of the that you have these issues, right? So after what that manifests would be as or whatever is afterwards, you would be like, okay, that wasn't good. I don't feel good because you're not in the heated argument anymore, and that usually takes when you're in it, it's very hard. So usually it has to be a retrospective first, and then a prospective later, because then you could reassess and do a debriefing with yourself and be like, huddling with yourself, being like, hey, what went on there? What can I do? What's the strategy for next time? And naturally, because you want to win the argument anyway, you're gonna replay the conversation over and over again. Oh man, I should have said this. I should have said this. She was wrong here, whatever. And then if you have that and you're willing to try to think about how to win the argument, then it's about reframing your mind to how do I how do I make the relationship win the argument? And how you do that is assessing what was the trigger. Usually anger is a secondary emotion, so it's a secondary to hurt or secondary to guilt or feeling trapped that or being resentful. So if you can dissect where it comes from, then you can assess, okay, why was I hurt? Why was that secondary emotion there? For me, what really does help after doing that is telling yourself next time, if you can. It's almost impossible for the first couple of times, but make it a mission that, especially if you're having arguments throughout several days or you're feeling resentful over a couple of days, write down somewhere, and even like a sticky pad on wherever you are, like I don't know, your washroom mirror or your laptop. Write a sticky pad and write, take a breath, ask yourself what you're feeling. And that's what I would do is I took a breath, and if it's over the phone, be very careful about breathing out because it sounds like a sigh, and when it sounds like a sigh, the other person will get pissed. But so when you breathe out, name those feelings you have. If you have a problem with naming feelings, I suggest you open up Google and just put list of feelings, in, of course, your primary language. In English, we have so many different words. I'm not sure if it's the same in other languages. Probably not in Eastern Europeans, hence why they're so cold. I'm Eastern European, so I could say that. But it's being able to identify the feelings. If you can even just say that you're feeling like three things at once, then that kind of diffuses it. And again, you don't say I am angry, I am feeling angry, because then that puts distance between you and the emotion. And then once you're able to be aware of that, that's the first step you can do to make change, and that has helped me a lot. When I had an argument, I had a particular argument with my ex. She said she made a comment about about uh, about my nutrition or something like that, and I'm very passionate about that. And I don't know, that particular day, it really got to me. And so when she said that, I actually did take a breath, and I was like, holy shit, okay, I'm angry, I'm resentful from something else, I'm uh, I'm I'm ashamed, and I feel guilty. I feel guilty for feeling all those three things. And for me, over time I learned that guilt's a very strong driver of my emotions. So that's something I worked on a lot. But just being able to put space to that, I'm like, oh, okay, she hit me with four emotions, and she didn't even mean to do that. Maybe it was a joke. And I felt like I could feel those emotions, but the truth is what matters is how I react to them. So then I chose to react to them in a different way, and instead of being upset, I just played it off as a joke. And as it turns out, we just had a like really funny conversation afterwards, which could have been an argument, which almost was.
Such a valuable insight, man. I can't tell you how much that helps even in some situations that I am in my life. And I can only imagine how much it benefits the listeners as well. So thank you for sharing and really going detailed on that. Actually identifying the feelings that you're feeling. And I like what you also emphasized, the long-term win, like what rather than what helps you win in the argument is what helps us win. And that's a really cool shift in the mindset. I also really like the idea of applauding the good traits. When you were actually able to dodge what your autopilot would have resulted in, and usually that would have been a very negative reaction, right? Like your autopilot could have done something wrong, and because you consciously took the wheel and you stirred clear of it, and in fact you came out better because of it, actually applauding that, and also how little that happens. I remember, Camille, we got together the other day. I think it was a few weeks ago. We got together at a local pizza place with ourselves and another friend, and we all like literally. side by side pulled up into the parking lot on time. And I remember that I just needed to say it. I was like, man, shout out to showing up on time, right? Like we always give flack for people showing up late. And we're always using that as like, oh, it sucks that you're late, and negative energy towards that result. But how often do we applaud someone coming on time? And I love that when you start rewarding those behaviors, I kind of think of the encouragement of raising children in that same way. You start encouraging and applauding their positive behaviors, they're more likely to do it based on the fact that they want that applause again, rather than the other way around, where out of fear they're staying away from the negative behavior. And I think that it's worth bringing that into your own mindset and your own internal conversations. We talked a lot about conversations, which was the very first chapter of this series, and I think it's worth resurfacing the importance of bringing back the conversations that gives you a better relationship with yourself, right? And the better relationship with yourself really comes down to if you're enforcing positive conversation or if you're actually having resentment for yourself. When something tries to talk you out of things, and the voice in your head really tries to talk you out of it, and you somehow prove it wrong. Even if you proved it wrong and you got the outcome that you wanted, you still have a bad relationship with yourself, because it's the equivalent of proving a friend wrong and being like, having that idea in the back of your mind that your friend was against you. And when you have that idea in the back of your mind that your own mind is against you, it gets a little hectic. And I think this is the same manner, where it's like applauding those positive behaviors gives yourself a better relationship with yourself, which I think doesn't get done enough. And I really love the idea of pointing out those feelings, as you mentioned. And then what I would add as a second layer is applauding your ability to get away from those, because that also feels good. And when that feels good, you're more likely to do it. I think about some of the moments that I recap out of different areas of my life. For example, when I think of me playing basketball recreationally, the moment that instantly comes to my head is the moment where I shot the game-winning shot, and it was the one that won the game, and everyone applauded because it felt so damn good. In fact, for the video viewers, if you're watching the shirt that I'm wearing today, the shirt that I'm wearing today is the most iconic shot that was ever made in Toronto Raptors history, when Kawhi Leonard pulled up for the buzzer beater, the final shot of the game, and game 7 against Philadelphia 76ers. And it bounced off the rim, I believe 4 or 5 times, and it went in. And because of that, we went to the NBA finals and won the championships. It's always, for me, the most iconic moment in Toronto history. So when you think back of iconic moments, I like that it's those high disruption, high energy, high positivity, that chemical moment. When I watched this game, Camille, I jumped out of my chair screaming. And I remember I was in a public lounge, and I went around and I high-fived everyone in that venue. What if you had that feeling? What if that's what you did when you dodged a bad day, when you dodged a bad situation? Having that awareness that you were able to stir clear out of a bad situation, and you're mentally applauding and running around and high-fiving everybody. That's a historic moment. And that's something that I've been trying to craft inside of me, albeit not to my full perfection, but something that's definitely in the works, where I'm trying to figure out those positive things that I've done that I want to reward myself for as well.
Yeah, I had to say that is one of the most powerful things, and especially it's a good thing you brought it up, because I've done that in previous relationships before, and that has shown a lot of success, especially in cultivating good behaviors around arguments and improving them. Just through that, being like, you know what, I'm so proud of us that we can talk about this before it becomes an issue. Or I'm so proud of us that, even though we had this disagreement, that we could walk away and both not be upset at each other. Or I'm proud of us that we don't resort to name calling, such as that. There was there's a particular study that really emphasizes the point of this. And there were a couple neuroscientists back in the day that they put babies like in those high chairs, and they had like the typical like a board where if you put like a circle through the circle, it goes down, and there's star shape, square, whatever. And what they practiced was using praise, like yay, like that clapping, to enforce the behaviors. And So they practiced, trying to teach the kids being able to, like, put the ball in the ball and the square in the square and the star in the star. And they found the people that the babies that put it in, they didn't give praise for, whatever. They would eventually, though, they would get it, but they wouldn't be able to repeat it as well as the ones that they gave praise for when they got it right. However, you can also make this into something terrible, which is what the third group did. And what they did is they praised the baby for putting the square in the circle hole. Even though it wouldn't go through, they gave praise. And because of that, they essentially made the baby dumb because they thought it would work and they kept praising it for that. And when they put the right one in, they didn't give praise. So the baby next time would put the square in the circle and it would just reinforce the bad behavior. So also how that works in relationships is that if you give energy or positive energy and maybe you don't even think it's positive at the same time to those bad behaviors, like for instance, if let's say a partner threatens to leave you and you decide that you feel so insecure that you're like, oh my god, I'll do anything, don't go, stay, and you show that desire and then you compensate by doing more positive things, naturally you're teaching the person that if they threaten to leave the relationship, they're going to get what they want and more. So you're cultivating this vicious cycle of bad behavior gives it makes the relationship stronger. And as a result, naturally you become in a toxic relationship. And so I'm glad that you brought that up because it could also extend to like bad behaviors as well. So you have to be very careful and intentional of what you praise and what you punish as well.
Yeah, yeah, and this actually makes me also think a lot about being aware of your behaviors and why you do what you do and the way that you were raised. I've had a lot of challenges with this in my upbringing of the strict family hold that I was under, right? And you kind of see this happening a lot, with my family. There's a lot of challenges where bad behavior was frequently rewarded, right? And not my bad behavior. It would be like if my mother acted out in a way to make a point, we would do what she wanted us to do, or like we would favor that because she acted out. And then which reassures the idea that if she acts out the next time, she'll get her way again. It's also, you're right. I love that emphasis is applauding the wrong things. Also reinforce it. And it's not always applauding, right? It's not always cut and dry. Sometimes it's the fact that you let it go or you caved in based on the fact that you felt like even though it was approached the wrong way, in the short term, you thought you're de-escalating the situation by just doing the easiest thing, the path of least resistance, and doing the thing that will quickly end that debate and end that argument because the argument doesn't feel good, not realizing long term that you have just made it very, very evident that this is the way to get their way, every single time. And I can see that being toxic. So I have a debate that I want to throw into the ring here that's worth thinking about, which came to mind based on what you just said about the experimenting that they've done with shapes, which is about rewarding people that are awarding kids that go and have their little soccer tournaments and lose, right? And we talk about like giving away like participation trophies and like sixth place medal, like are those a thing? So let's use the example of when a parent takes their kids for ice cream, regardless of whether they win or lose, right? And you think about the arguments on both sides. There's one argument on one side that says, "Hey, like we shouldn't give them a reward, the same reward for winning, because that makes them realize that it's not worth trying harder or getting better." But then on the other side, there's also the fact that they showed up, and the fact that they played their best, and the fact that life isn't always just about the score. It's also about the journey and doing whatever you can. There's a great debate on both sides. What I'm curious is about, based on your example of the experiment with shapes, where do you fall in your belief of the upbringing of how people are rewarded, whether or not they win or lose?
I think you should. It really depends on how you reward them and when you do. Because if you reward them after, then, like, okay, if you reward them with the participation as soon as they participate, I agree with that. If you reward them after, regardless of the outcome, they're just going to associate the outcome. So you want people to feel encouraged when they try. And if you don't encourage the effort, then whatever. But if you encourage the outcome regardless of the effort put in, everyone's naturally going to take the path of least resistance. And especially in children, they can't differentiate between that, right? That's why they say with puppies, when you're training a dog and it's a puppy, if they poop, you rub it in their nose, but only if you see it happen. If you don't see it happen, then it's too late. If you just rub it in their nose, they're just not going to understand why are they getting punished. In the same way, how you reward them, especially someone in their early development. So it's easy to bring it back to that. But also, I argue that there's a huge problem with rewarding people, I think, with food. Because essentially, you now taught children that ice cream is a reward. And because of that, it naturally extends to bad eating habits, in my opinion. I think, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying cut ice cream out completely, but I think we also have a growing problem in society where everyone's getting more obese. Diabetes is almost like the financial and global burden of diabetes itself is ridiculous, and it's estimated it's going to bankrupt healthcare in a couple of years. And no one's thinking about the micro when it comes to like food is reward. Food is a reward. It's a social thing. Don't get me wrong, but we framed ourselves to see these unhealthy foods as rewards that it's almost a punishment to eat healthy. And so, going back to your debate, though,
And can I just say, I did not expect this third dimension of way of thinking. Like I just use ice cream as the example, but it's also interesting. It's like, why did I use ice cream as an example? Like, did I see that as a reward symbol? But gosh, that's such a good way of great perspective. It's like the thing that you reward with also sets in motion their definition of a reward. But go on. I just wanted to point that out. I thought that was a fascinating curveball that I did not expect.
yeah, yeah. Sorry, it's just I get nerdy about this stuff just because I really want to work with preventing chronic illness in the future. But anyway, so going back to rewarding participation, I think essentially yes, you really have to reward participation, especially the first time. Um, and you just have to be intentional about it, right? If you and you have to be very very deliberate with the way you do it and very specific, right? If you tell the child, you know what, it's amazing that you're putting yourself out there and you're going and trying, then that's amazing. Then that I think that's a great way to do it. But if you reward them for the outcome regardless of the effort, whether they win or lose, then that's not a good thing. And I think that if they lose, there is something to comfort and relief, but I think it has to be intentional. And if the reward for winning is the same as them losing, I don't think there's a point, and it devalues their sense of their ideal, in my opinion. And why should they aim higher when they could be at this level and achieve the same and get the same outcome or the same reward?
100%. And I think I'm on the same page with you. I bring this up because there's a lot of big influencers out there like Gary Vaynerchuk, right? And they have that mindset. I think Gary Vaynerchuk is the one that says, stop giving participation trophies. And I get it that on the macro, he's saying like, stop rewarding people for not getting the best. But at the same time, I have my own version of that perspective, which is I do believe that it depends on what you're trying to do. Because when you're saying don't give participation trophies, you're also saying that they should feel bad for not winning, right? And like they should feel bad. They should almost get punished for not winning. They didn't get anything at all, and they put in all this effort, so they feel bad going home. And the mentality is they're gonna feel bad, so they're gonna try harder to get better. But my thing is like, why do you need to feel bad to get better, right? And it's worth pointing out that a gold medal is far more extravagant than a bronze medal, right? That means that you can still get more. Just the same way as the first place trophy is far more extravagant than what a participation trophy looks like and what it represents. So when I think of as the guy that believes in the mentality of what matters is showing up and getting 1% better and keep getting better, I think what's exciting to me is getting that reward for showing up first, but then also knowing there's better rewards if you perform better, right? Like knowing that I got a bronze, but if I do more work, if I try harder and I get better, I could get a gold medal. And so I don't believe in the whole mentality of feel bad because you showed up and didn't perform to the highest caliber. Because I think what's more important, more often than not, is showing up and doing the work than actually doing the best, right? We always talk about action over perfection, and that's what I believe in. So when you take perfection out of the equation, perfection taking out of the equation means that someone may perform better than you that day. You may not be the best performer that day. Does that mean you go home and beat yourself up? Or does that mean you get motivated knowing that you can do better, but still feel good about the fact that you showed up? I choose the latter. I really believe that the latter is the way to go because I love the idea. You know, I told you the other day that I'm feeling a slight injury occurring on my right shoulder cuff, and I'm starting to get a little worried because I feel like I'm starting to hit a ceiling of how heavy I can lift. And I also told you that my workout last week was by far the worst workout I had this year. But you know what? I didn't feel bad because I knew that my worst workout of 2021 might actually be more than what most people do in all of 2021 and by not getting out of their couch and by not showing up. And because of that, I don't feel bad about it. It's the awareness that I could do better and we can be better, right? And because of that, it's that level of wanting to improve things. So I've had a little bit of like I put some thought behind it too, because I gotta admit, when I first heard individuals like Gary Vaynerchuk, who I very much look up to, and I think it's great at his level of mindset and thinking. But when he said that, it took me a little bit by surprise. And at first I was like, yeah, of course, we should be rewarding people for losing. But then I started thinking of if that was the real life version of the literal term of what he said is don't give them participation trophies, only give the winners the trophy and no one else, let the losers lose. I thought about what kind of an impact that would make. And I think about how many people would quit that sport because it felt bad. How many people would have self-confident issues? How many people would actually have negative feelings toward that activity because of that feeling like shit feeling, where you could feel like you've done good. You could like that sport, you could enjoy it, and you could want to get better. And because of that, I've actually really reframed my outlook around the perspective of what losing really means. Did you really lose? Like, what is the definition of losing? Is it what's being dictated by that item on the scoreboard? Maybe, if that's the game that you're playing, but that's not the case in life, right? It's not a scoreboard every day that's telling you whether you're winning or losing. There's always opportunities for you to perform, feel good about your level of performance, and the ability to show up and then get better each and every day.
And see, here's what I think about that too. Like, I absolutely agree with what you said, especially about life, is that it's about the effort you put in and that you're improving and that you're getting better and that you shouldn't discourage someone from trying to get better. At the same time, though, in real life, effort doesn't always translate to an outcome. So if you give participation trophies, I feel like when they go out in the real world, they'll expect an outcome. They'll expect a reward. But sometimes when your efforts don't give you the reward, maybe it's not apparent. The reward is actually that you're improving. It's just no one gives you an external validation from it. And it's about the internal one that you get. So I think giving that participation trophy eliminates that awareness of that internal validation through the external. And so, what I think should happen is that they absolutely shouldn't feel bad for losing. And the way to mitigate that is to have a good support system. To be like, well, you guys didn't win this time, but maybe next time. And then, encouraging and using it as an opportunity for the child to learn about, their feelings of disappointment or doubt or why they feel like they are feeling bad. Like, what is it about that? And then giving them that emotional maturity to grow through that and learning that it's okay to feel that way. Just don't let it consume you. So even that is a good lesson for children to have, especially since real life effort doesn't always translate to reward. And that's why I strongly believe that participation trophies are eliminating eliminating people from putting in more effort just by subconsciously giving an external validator to everything that they do.
Yeah, and I'm torn on this, and I'm gonna try to give you one more variation of what I where I think this makes sense, which is the idea that I really don't think that winning or losing really comes down to that final outcome of what society tells you it is. Let me use my journal as an example, right? So yesterday I finally announced that we have a launch date for my journal. And I have hopes and ambition that it's going to make quite a bit of revenue because I really believe this is going to be a huge impact in society and that there'll be a lot that we'll be able to sell. Let's say it doesn't sell, right? Let's say it does terrible and I don't even break even. Let's say I took a loss on the amount of money that I put into bringing this to life. Should I feel bad about it? Right? Let's think this through. Like, should I feel bad about the fact that it undersold? Well, it depends. Was my purpose in life to sell journals, or was my purpose in life to generate skills to figure out what my real impact is? Like, was that my purpose in life? Is to sell a million journals? What if it's not? And for me, it's not, right? Like for me, we've talked about this at the very beginning, which is I want to make an impact of helping other individuals, being a helping hand for other individuals. Let's say I crashed and burned on this journal. My participation trophy in this example is the fact that I learned a lot about how to put a product together. I learned about what works in marketing and what doesn't. I learned about maybe the fact that I priced it incorrectly. I learned a lot about what actually got me sales, a couple sales, and what didn't. I learned so much from it that my version of that win my version of that participation trophy is all of that, which still makes me feel good. Right now, there's obviously a threshold because I wouldn't want to go bankrupt, right? I wouldn't want to put every dime I have to a point where now my lifestyle, like I have to now get rid of my home. I have to now like reduce my quality of life. There's obviously a level of risk, but at the same time, like I still think the participation trophy isn't always literally a tangible gift. Sometimes it's other things out there that are still considered a feel good. And because of that, I actually get less and less attached to outcomes, right? And the outcomes to me, they talk about like it's not about the destination, it's the journey. And I really believe that because from this perspective, it makes a lot of sense. It's not about how many sales I made, but what have I continued picking up every step of the way that so that it continues driving my mission. If my goal in life was only to sell this journal and nothing else, like that was my whole dream. Like as a kid, all I ever wanted to do was produce a productivity journal and sell it, then I think I would be approaching the product very, very different. Like I think I'd be everything I do around my marketing and branding. My whole podcast would be around productivity journal. My whole social media would be around it. That's all I would talk about when I go on stage. I think it would be very different. So because of that, there might have been a higher percentage of success. But if it's not, maybe my goal wasn't to become the Ronaldo of soccer when I was a little kid on the field. My goal isn't to be the top goal scorer, but it's to socialize, it's to make friends, it's to network, right? Is to get closer with my brother because maybe my brother's on my team, right? There's other variables that's considered success in that environment, and because of that, my participation trophy is something else that's not winning the game. Does that make a little bit more sense in terms of the case? Because in many ways, I understand the risk of maybe they lose the motivation of getting better. I do understand that, but it depends on what that prize is. If it's the exact prize as the first place, I'm strongly against that. But I think there's a lot more that a prize could be considered. And I loved your emphasis on support system because in many ways, a support system is reiterating that, like, hey, there is still a win, there's still a benefit, so you don't need to feel like shit about it.
I would argue then, if it's because, like you said, I also agree. The reward shouldn't be about that. It's about the skills you picked up, the time you spent, and the participation trophy can be, well, first of all, the health aspect that you are moving around and exercising. It can be the social aspect, which is you're on a team, you're with people. There's that sense of belonging because you're on a team and you have a role to play, and there's that sense of competition as well. And as long as it's healthy and friendly competition, it's very, very good for health. for your mental health especially. And the participation trophy can also be your parents teaching you or encouraging you for trying, even though it didn't work out. And I think that as soon as you put an external variable, which or external piece, which is that physical trophy, then they focus on that, or all those other things are diminished. I think it should be rewarded to the top teams, just so people have something to aim at, and the and if they feel bad for not reaching the trophy, then it's about learning how to manage those feelings surrounding that. Is that really your purpose? Is that really your goal? Do you really want that trophy? Why? Do you really want to be the best soccer player? That's the whole point. As soon as you give those participation trophies, I feel like you eliminate a huge uh, part of the learning process of how to manage your own emotions. And I get it that not every family is as aware, or not every child has the opportunities and the privileges to be able to sit with those negative emotions and learn how to manage them and how to turn them into a positive outlook and positive lessons. But I feel like giving every child an external piece of validation diminishes the opportunity there and also reinforces this negative outlook that we have now, that if whatever we do, we have to be good at, because we get a reward from it at the end of the day. Sometimes it's not about the reward isn't as obvious. It could be something internal. And that's something that you have to learn to access. If you can't access the internal rewards and you have to look for the external, you're teaching people to be materialistic, to be outcome based, just on the sense of, what they get. They're looking at what they get from other people, from the world, and they become resentful when they don't get it. I feel like it's all like, again, if we constantly talk about focusing on the journey, then it has to be from within.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. And this opens up conversations around self-entitlement, right? Because they were raised their entire life that something good's supposed to happen. So what happens when the world punches them in the mouth? And then there's the other part, which is like managing their level of ego, thinking that they deserve something out of everything going forward. And as you said, materialistic things, which actually really opens up a heavy debate about the conversations that you have when you're younger and the upbringing. But that level of self-awareness is very, very important, because it is the need for recognizing what you got out of it and also maintaining your humility along the way. I also just want to very quickly, before I talk about the other parts of self-awareness, I want to first and foremost say that I'm such a big fan of this podcast show, not just because I'm a host on it, but because from all the podcast shows I listen to, there's nothing more I enjoy than hearing like very, very strong debates about a topic. And I feel like you and I sometimes have contradictory way of thinking. And I really appreciate the ability to put that into the ring, because at the end of the day, one thing I strongly believe in is listeners being able to benefit from multiple ideas and realizing that there's not only one way to win. And the fact that we do that very openly is very heavy. But as we transition into the next part of this, I also want to encourage the listeners to participate in these debates. Like, what are your thoughts around participation trophies? What are your thoughts around getting rewarded, even if it's in a different way, for showing up and doing your best and trying to get better? We'd love to hear from you. Whether you're listening to it on YouTube, whether you follow us on Instagram on the Modern Mindset Podcast, let us know in the comments and your feedback. And as always, please just show us some love by hitting like and subscribing, so that it does all the magic in the world of social media algorithm and presents our topics and our value to other members of our community. I think it'd be very helpful for us. But what I did want to talk about, Camille, in the level of self-awareness also, is recognizing what you're good at so you know what you pursue, right? Is the idea of banking on your strengths. And we kind of briefly talked about this in our last episode, where with efficiencies, we talked about having different energy drainers and energy boosters. And we talked about how everyone has different levels of energy drainers and energy boosters. And if you're not aware of what's yours, you're kind of going on autopilot. And some days you'll feel more drained than others. And you just won't be able to figure out what that is. And I think that's worth thinking about as well for ambition, right? You think about what you want to do in life, what drives you. And I talked about this many times in the past on either through social media or on stage, but I talk a lot about when you get very excited when you're talking about something or thinking about something. You know, if we talked about certain music I like, or you talk about basketball, or you talk about a Gary V video or a book that I read, there's a part inside of me that causes my heart rate to increase in excitement. And I think it's worth paying attention to the way your body responds to different themes, because what that does is, in many ways, it gives you a little bit of light on the things that you're passionate about, things that drives you. And if I imagine that the individuals that became the best in the sports that they're in, or became the best in the craft, or started the business that made them billions, and they're doing it for a very long time, that there was something inside of their body that when they tasted that thing, it got them really excited. Which in many ways, I think of when you picked up the bow for the first time in archery, you got that level of excitement inside of you that said, I think I want to pursue this a bit more. Can you talk to me a little bit about self-awareness around passion? How you get aware around passion. We talked about this a little bit in past chapters about tasting things, but what have you noticed that drives you? We can talk about your interest in medicine, why you pursued that path in your career and your studies. We could talk about a lot of the hobbies you picked up, like picking up a guitar. Where do those levels come from? Is it simply from tasting, or is there something along the way that made you aware that these are things that you want to pursue?
Yeah, that becomes a very interesting topic to me as well. Like, why do we like the things that we like, and why do we choose what we do? For me, what I notice is the feeling of when I do it, because there's that initial awkward phase where you don't know what you're doing and you're kind of hoping that it goes right. And then when it does, you get that huge dopamine release that you get so excited that, oh my God, I actually got it right this time. And with me, the activities I've tried and what I've been really interested in is what I find fascinating is that sense of there's a sense of peace for me, and what that is when what I realize is that's me being in the moment, in the zone, as they would call it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm good at it, but when I find myself losing track of time or not thinking about anything else, especially with my mind being labeled as an overthinker and a dreamer. When that part shuts off and just is focused on this thing that I'm doing right now, that is the first and the best sign that I'm interested in it. And for me, the excitement piece is something that I don't have access to a lot of times. So when it does happen, it is almost like a shock. Like, oh, I'm actually excited about this instead of, almost indifferent or kind of curious about it. Because for me, I've actually like taken a personality test and I got like less than 1 percentile on excitement on discoverme.com, I think it was. It's a very good personality test if you believe in the ocean theory of personality and the big five. And it kind of makes sense to me that I don't get as enthusiastic as other people do when they do the things that they love. But it's funny enough because when I express myself performing those actions, I do feel like I'm enthusiastic. Having that access to the emotion at the period of when I'm doing it, though, seems very difficult. So when it does happen, that's a very good sign. The main piece for me is that sense of peace and not losing myself in it. And funny enough that you brought up the guitar, because I first got a guitar when I was 14, and I had to beg my parents for a year, and they said, "No, you're just gonna pick it up for 10 minutes, and then like you'll never play it again." I'm like, "No, no, I'll do it," and I kept like, maybe like 3 times a week, I would be like, "Hey," and like, "Please, a guitar for my birthday, a guitar for Christmas, just something, please, just anything. I don't care if it's a cheap one. I just want to try guitar," and that came from me getting into music and really enjoying listening to it, and then I thought guitar was my way to perform. And so, because I wanted to emulate what I liked listening to. And when I got a guitar for the first time, I picked it up, played for 5 minutes, realized it was hard, and I dropped it. And I didn't play it again for another 2 years. And what happened was I started listening to music more and more complicated forms of it in high school, and I realized that I was able to escape in these songs that people create, and I actually got into like instrumentals and guitar, and I was like, oh my god, like this is amazing, like it's so complex yet I feel like almost entranced by it, and like I feel like I'm listening to these little intricacies, and I know that I'm a person for the finer details. And then when I started picking up again, I practiced for 4 hours a day, and I self taught me how to play guitar, and that came from this curiosity that kind of overcame that resistance of that anxious awkwardness that my fingers hurt, I'm doing something wrong, and I feel like it's worth the sacrifice. Like to push through the pain is worth pursuing this. So why I bring that up is is I feel like in order to discover what you love and what will stick with you, you also have to recognize that everything you do, you have to sacrifice something in order to chase it. And when you tell yourself, this is worth it, and actually feeling that in the moment, I think is maybe the best sign you have that you found your passion.
You talked about the guitar story, and it makes me think about my guitar story as well, which is as soon as I met you and you introduced me to the world of beautiful music being created through acoustic guitars, I immediately said, hey, get in my car. We're going to Long and McQuaid, a local music store here, and I'm going to go spend a couple $100 and buy myself a nice guitar. I took you to the store with me and trusted your expertise, and you picked up a beautiful piece, and I immediately made the purchase and brought it home. And I think after doing a couple lessons with you, I became Camille version one, which is never picked up that guitar again after realizing how difficult it was. And there's a lot of wisdom there. You know, the wisdom of what was it that first got my attention, what made me gravitate towards it had nothing to do with the love of the guitar. It's just you look like a badass holding it, and we just know that girls love guys with guitars. It's
Yeah.
just you start thinking of all the other reasons of why you think this is your passion, and you pick it up. And at the very beginning, I feel like you always underestimate the amount of work and the amount of challenges you have to overcome in order to really pursue the passion at a level of excellence. Right. And to me, like that's with everything. One thing that I also remember, similar to the guitar story, is that I fell in love with the idea of drop shipping. Drop shipping sounded so glorious. In the world of using the internet every day, there's an idea that you can build up a store and you can sell products that you don't even own. You can find products from a cheap wholesaler in China, and you can set it up on your store. And if someone buys it, they'll ship it right from China to their doorstep. So you don't even have inventory. So I could literally sell anything that I wanted, and I don't even have to deal with the product. This was beautiful. And I mean, that sounds freaking fantastic. And I imagine people listening to this are probably going to Google drop shipping after. It's a massive industry, and there's a lot of people making money from it. But even when I say a lot of people, that may be like less than 1% of all drop shippers, right? And those are the things that you sometimes forget because you just see the success stories. When I see the guitar, I see the best guitar players out there, and I think like, hey, I can beat them, not realizing the amount of work that's necessary to get there. And when I set up my drop shipping, I was very quickly discouraged by the fact that it took a lot of work to get people on my website because it's a very competitive space. Then I had to deal with the fact that some people didn't receive the product from China, and now I got to handle customer service and refunds and not even being sure if they actually received the product or not. And people filing complaints about my store, and me just one day realizing that this isn't fun. And even though I made a very small fortune, I very quickly decided that this isn't something that I wanted to spend a lot of time on. I thought this was going to buy me time, being able to automate sales. I was spending 16 hours a day on this website trying to figure stuff out. So And one day I decided I was going to just shut down the store and never look back. And I decided to do it for that reason. So what you mentioned there was worth discussing is the idea of letting the high settle first. You get high on the fact that you see the full story of you at the ultimate 1% level of success. The star guitar player, the star soccer player, the star of this business initiative. When we every time someone launches a business, they're already picturing like, man, I could be Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. I could be all these people, and you don't realize the tiny magnitude of percentage of people that ever get to that level. And it's not until they get hit in the punch in the face that they now need to make a decision like, do they still love the passion for the passion? And that's actually a moment of awareness. It's a moment of realizing like, do you actually love playing the guitar, or do you love what guitar can offer? And then when you think about what guitar can offer, you also start saying, hey, maybe I don't need to play music to impress girls. Maybe I'll just be more charming. Maybe I'll just buy better clothes. And then you start seeing alternatives, only to realizing that getting the guitar was actually not what you wanted to do. And I think that level of awareness is very important, which is first and foremost, go and taste, right? It's worth tasting. And I can also tell you, it's worth tasting how to play a guitar without buying a guitar. You don't have to break the bank. You can actually go and pick up your friend's guitar, or even walk into a Long and McQuaid and play with one of the guitars. It's worth tasting something for the first time, and it may only cost you a little bit of money. After tasting it, realizing the work that's needed to play it to perform that passion at a level of excellence, and deciding, as you suggested, deciding, is it still worth pursuing despite of all the challenges that are required along the way. And I think there lies a level of understanding. The final part I'm going to add to this is seeing whether or not it aligns with your core of what you believe in or what you want to achieve, right? Sometimes they're hobbies, and I understand that it may not be a direct correlation with, if you have a goal in life of wanting to help people, why on earth are you wasting time playing the guitar, right? There's not a direct correlation all the time, but the truth is there's more you want out of life than that one thing. So first thing is like, what are those things that you want out of life? And then, are the things that you're doing allowing you to do or become the person that can achieve that? And when you start thinking about that, it also makes you realize how to spend your time, as we talked about in the last chapter, how to spend more time on the right efficiencies along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the last bit, I completely agree with. If if you really want to chase those hobbies, and you have to ask yourself, does this align with who I want to be? And sometimes the easiest way to do that is, if we go back to guitar, what does a guitarist look like for you? Like, a guitarist to me seems like almost like a rebellious, kind of free spirited, creative, free person. And that's on the surface. And then if you dig it down, it can be very disciplined. There are like several different types. It can be very disciplined, very structured, knowledgeable, and kind of like practical and resourceful. And then which of those core values align with yours, and does that identity fit, right? I think with guitarists in general, you can look at them as rock stars, and then that's where it gets murky, because you look at rock stars, and then you can look at Beethoven, which wasn't a guitar player, but he was a classical composer, and those are just two prime examples that I think the public would resonate with the most, because they're quite well known. And what in that, learning about the identity of whatever that person is that has the hobby that you're thinking about, you can actually compare the two. Is that something you want to become? And is that do they share the same core values? Because if they do, then it's a good sign that it could be a great fit for you. And like you mentioned as well, maybe the avenue could be different. Like, if you're picking up guitar to pick up girls, then there are several different ways to pick up girls. And why is that avenue your choice? Is it because it's the easiest way, or is it because it has some other benefit to it? It makes sense. And then you have to ask yourself, like, that's an outcome to pick up girls. Why? What is it about that outcome that you want? Is it because you want to be in a relationship? Is it because you want to explore the people and life in general? Then you have to ask yourself these deeper questions, and that's where it gets very complicated, and the details do matter. So I think being aware of what you want is paramount. And like you said, the best thing to do is to taste it. Or if you can't taste it, then the next best thing is to read about it or to hear people talk about it. And then you think, oh man, do I want this? And then of course you have to recognize that you're listening to experts. So you're going to think about the 1% and you're going to be excited about the guy that climbs Everest. But then when you realize what you really have to put in and the fact that it costs $50,000 to climb it and that a lot of people die from it, you're going to realize that there's something to be said about, being realistic, because you're looking at the ideal, and you have to compare the journey to that ideal with what you expect to happen and also what you're willing to let happen, because work is inevitable, and to be diligent you have to be able to be in the journey. And as we discussed multiple times, if you're just solely focused on the outcome, then you miss out on the journey and you're going to end up being burnt out and unhappy. So building that awareness uh, surrounding these passions, I think, is the most important part. And I think we can talk a lot about that. I think we did discuss a lot about that, actually. And I think it extends to a lot more than just core values. Like, how are you aware of your own core values? I think that's a discussion a lot of people aren't really comfortable having, because they think it's just so natural. But to me, it isn't. I recently discovered that one of my core values is based in spirituality. Like, I believe I live a religious life, even though I don't believe in a religion per se. And that's something I discovered 3 months ago, and I'm almost 30. And it's because no one encouraged that. No one encouraged these discussions, and and I wasn't aware of how important it was to me, because I was neglecting the actions that I'm taking now and the people I admire and the ideas that I admire. So I'm curious with you as well, if you have any kind of approach to core values and being aware of them.
You hinted at this very, very quickly and very nonchalantly in your last statement, which you talked about the benefit of how curiosity allowed you to taste more things. And I spoke at an event last week, and one of the questions after my speaking was, someone asked, what are the core skills that I need to have in order to succeed in this industry? And I said, there's two very important ones. Number one is communication. And I said, I don't just mean being fluent in the language. I mean, you need to be able to get an idea across and articulate it in a way that resonates. And I talked a lot about that. And then I finished off with number two being that curiosity. And I said aggressive curiosity, that you're aggressively searching for answers that you didn't even have questions for. And what that looks like is the fact that if you're relying on your day-to-day conversations to get you new ideas and new suggestions and new things to taste, you're very unlikely to get that, especially when you're living a life with routines in place, right? It's not as common. Think about the last time you walked into a coffee shop or a lounge or a bar or somewhere, and you're seeing people have an introspective conversation about their core beliefs. It doesn't happen as often. And you and I have really gone out of our way to try to make that a mission of ours, with the belief in better conversations. Where the benefit comes in is when you let your curiosity find those answers, because they're out there. Your discovery around spirituality, I imagine, came as a result of listening to the right conversation at the right time from someone that maybe you never met in your life, right? Someone that you maybe found, and that could have been through a YouTube video, it could have been through a book, it could have been an audiobook, a podcast, and so forth. Is that part of your routine? Or do people have that as part of their routine, as the ability to learn something new? And to learn something new doesn't need to be a skill. It could be learn a new idea. I'm working right now through Jordan Peterson's book, The 12 Rules of Life. And I have to credit you. I think you put me on it for the first time. And I was just listening to the other day, and I'm on that chapter now where he's talking about the fact that people rarely think. Like, we think we think we're thinking, but we're rarely doing actually intentional deep thinking, because what we're usually doing is criticizing, right? We're thinking a lot about what just happened, and we're criticizing that memory. and we're just beating it down rather than trying to think and have critical thinking. And he said the critical thinking component occurs when you actually think about having a second voice that's debating with each other and giving you contradictory ideas and challenging, very much like what you and I just did earlier in this episode. And that's very rare to do in your own internal health, in your own internal head, because you have your own bias. And your bias is going to make it hard for you to have someone argue with your own bias when it's your own voice. So that's very difficult to do in your own head. And even the fact that I was able to articulate that came out of the fact that I was listening to a book. You understand? Like, that's not even my own idea, which is quite fascinating how often that happens. So I think about implementing something in your routine that allows you to flex your curiosity muscle. And that could be like taking some time out in the week of watching educational YouTube videos. That could be about listening to educational podcasts. And it doesn't have to be personal development. Like, pick something that you're into because you want to listen to it and you really want to pay attention to it. Spend time on very, very deep intellectual and introspective conversations with others. Make some time for that. And when you start doing that more and more, you start to realize that there really isn't a problem out there that there isn't an answer for. Now, whether it's the right answer or not is a different story, right? You got to kind of break that down and further research, but there is an answer out there. So I get excited about listening to something that opens a thought in my mind and makes me further research it. And then usually I go down this YouTube rabbit hole watching videos and looking up how-tos and seeing different variations, and it helps me come up with new ideas. And those ideas is what I either start implementing or I start thinking a lot more about and discussing with other individuals like yourself. The journal that I'm releasing, that came out of curiosity. I didn't just one day say, it's time for a new product. Let me do market research. Let me see what people want because I want to make some money and this may get me some money. It was simply the fact that by living life and paying attention, I started realizing that there's a need for this. And first of all, I realized there's a need for me to have something like this because I needed this tool, but later realizing that others also need this because this tool is lacking. So it's that curiosity that will spark ideas like that allows you to do things or act a certain way that will help you better define and construct that core value. You talked about your discovery around spirituality at the age of 30. I turned 35, and I can only say in the last year, I would say about the last year and a half now, that I've really found, I really felt like I truly discovered myself. And I wouldn't even say I truly discovered myself to a full extent, but I think I learned more about myself in the last year and a half than I have in the last 33. So don't let age be the variable that creates the level of stubbornness that prevents you from learning more. There's always the ability to learn more. And by positioning yourself in a world where you're constantly curious, while you're learning about externals, you're going to find that you're also learning about internals. And that's where it gets really, really exciting in the world of personal development.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially since we have such access to pretty much any information out there, it's amazing to know the things that you had no idea even existed and ideas that seem so contradictory and seem so counterintuitive, yet they somehow make sense when you look at it in a deeper picture. And these people that are experts, we have where before it was there was such a huge barrier to entry where you had to go to libraries or you had to talk to people and hopefully that they were good enough to even remember the expert's name. I couldn't even remember the first name of Gottman, and he's a huge expert, and actually his work really impacted my life significantly. Like, it's just amazing to know that there's so much out there that can be explored, and it is about having that curiosity and being open to it, and also being able to explore. I think is a very important aspect of learning about yourself too, because the more you expose yourself to different things, the more you have to challenge yourself, and when you challenge yourself, that's when you see what fits and what doesn't, and how you fit into that as well. And when you realize is when it fits naturally, there is something towards that. Is that from past experience, or is it because you didn't challenge yourself enough, and then you can push farther and you can discover more, and the more you venture into the unknown, the more it becomes known, and the more you can pull it out, you can create all sorts of things. And whether or not you choose to create it through implementing different behaviors within yourself or changing up your habits, I think is a powerful tool that you have. And it's crazy to think that people only see exploration through external means when the self exploration can just come from, like you said, having intentional critical thinking within yourself. You can really discover who you are, what you're feeling, and just being aware of your feelings. If you say to yourself, if you actually sit down and ask yourself how you're really feeling and just listen and be open to it, it's amazing that the answer will always show up. And what you do with that answer can completely change how you feel for the rest of the day and what you think about things. If you really be open to your own emotions, then you can truly have this sense of self-discovery and self-exploration, and that's where you can pivot yourself to change in the way that you want to.
Yeah, yeah, and when you talk about change and being able to put something into action, I also want to emphasize the realization that I've only had in the last 4 years, which is the fact that by simply betting on your strengths and really doing the things that you're good at, you can still make your ideas come to fruition. There's a lot of people that I think hesitate to make something happen because they feel like they don't have all the bases covered, right? Some people will think like, hey, I'm not an entrepreneur, so I can't do it. Hey, I'm not good at sales. Hey, I don't know how to publish the book. Hey, I don't know how to how to market it or how to edit it. Like there's a lot of excuses that comes out of the fact that people are worried that their weaknesses will prevent them from having success. And we talked a little bit about this in our last chapter where we discussed delegation. And I want to bring that back because I think it's so important over here. I said that I've only had this realization over the last 4 years because in some scenarios, I think we see this happening in our social lives, right? Like you'll be around a group of friends and you'll see someone that's maybe doing a better job socializing because that's something that they have that's something that's their strength, and maybe not as much as yours. Like maybe they're hilarious and maybe you're not. And I used to really, really hate that. I hated that I was like not the one that was like crushing it in social settings because my friends were funnier or they were just better at having conversations and they were more engaging. And, like there were just things that were getting them a lot more attention and validation in those situations. And there was a bit of an insecurity that I used to have around that until I realized that my strengths allows me to achieve a lot more. And it may not be the same thing. Like the outcome may not be about striking and becoming this glorious figure in a social setting, because that sometimes also becomes toxic because now you start doing like acts of manipulation and all these other things that gets a little hectic. But I'm saying like if you really believe what your strengths are, you're also going to realize all the incredible things that you could do that aren't going to drain you, as we talked about in the very beginning, right? Because when you try to be someone you're not, when I try to extend myself and be maybe a little bit louder, a little bit funnier, a little bit more aggressive, I start realizing that I'm burning out quicker and I'm actually not enjoying that experience. But when you start finding that strength, your level of awareness of discovering like these are the things that I'm good at, you actually can achieve a lot. And in fact, you can achieve anything you want to when you start crafting when you start stacking it with delegation. Because what happens is that you realize that you don't have to know the answers to anything. In fact, when I think about some of my biggest successes, I can honestly tell you that I wasn't the only person that made that happen, right? Like right now with my speaking career, like I'm securing multiple speaking careers a week and multiples a month. And a lot of these are paid speaking events. I'm not actually the one that's going out there and finding these speaking events. In fact, I'm not even the one that's sending that initial email. I'm the one that's booking the meetings and then actually showing up on stage. I'm actually working with people that are helping me with researching events that are out there, finding out the size of the events, finding out if I'm compatible based on my topics, finding out the price, and then connecting me. And then if the connection happens, I show up. So a lot of people think like, hey, for me to have a speaking career, as an example, they need to figure out all the steps, find, reach out, do, have the themes ready, have the media kit ready, all that stuff. You don't have to. You just got to figure out what your strengths are. With my book, the same thing. I got a publisher, I got a designer for the book, I got a proofreader, I got someone that formatted it, and I got someone that put it up on Amazon for me. This journal, exact same thing. You just got to focus on your lane of what you're good at. And if you focus on your lane is, you can still make the impact you want to make. You just don't have to figure out every single part of it. So, they used to always say like, oh, work on your weaknesses, or it's fine. Like you can YouTube and figure out how to do it. I actually go as far as saying, don't worry about how to do it if that's a weakness. And let me also put an asterisk there where I say that weakness is not the same thing as not knowing how to do it. Like you can learn anything, but you can also learn something and realize that this isn't your strength. I'm a short guy and I realize that I'm not going to be able to dunk on a basketball net anytime soon. I can YouTube all day about how to dunk, but it's still going to be a weakness of mine at the end of the day. So why worry about spending time trying to dunk when I could spend the time learning how to shoot? And realizing that kind of mentality changes your way of activating yourself in this world. When you think about how much energy you have, and if you're investing your time on the things that you're good at, the strengths, while delegating the things that maybe you're not as good at, you get far more done in a day, than a week, than a month, and then a year than the average person that's trying to do all of the above. And when you realize that, it's such a big piece that clicked for me 4 years ago. You can bring any idea to life. You just got to give it the same attention that you would for any one of your other passions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, with the whole delegation piece, that's how we learn as well. You don't learn everything by just exploring. I mean, in the same regard too, you don't learn math by just putting sticks together and being like, that's 2 plus 2. You learn from people that are experts in the field, and especially when it comes to, you know, in my case, I relate a lot to nutrition and exercise, to listening to the experts, and then like having these thoughts in my head and trying to be very critical in the analysis that I have towards that, and being like, does this work for me, or uh, does the research really support that? And then doing my own kind of analysis, and then eventually it does go into the experimental part, and then having the awareness within the moments of of being present when I'm being taught the lesson, of being present when and intentional of when I'm researching and criticizing, is does that piece of information fit for me, or am I curious enough to pursue it? And then afterwards, when I experiment or pursue it, looking to see if is something that works for me, is how we like go through life, and is very essential, because then we stand on the shoulders of giants. In relation to what you're saying too, you have this world has a bunch of experts at your disposal, and if you can delegate that, then you can create a better product, let's say, or you can go farther, or you can build something bigger, just because you have people that are using their strengths collectively, and you have an eclectic approach in taking the best out of the best experts, right? Instead of just focusing, spreading yourself thin and trying to be everything all at once, which is very exhausting. And you know what, devoting yourself to an idea is worth it in some cases, but you have to recognize that there are limitations to that, and limitations to yourself too. So being aware of those limitations, I feel like is also very important in recognizing whether or not you need help, and to delegate would be more efficient. Hence why we talked about it last week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm loving the order of our episodes that are coming out, because I think it's doing very much what we talked about in the last chapter, which is the idea of stacking. And I think we keep stacking on new ideas on where episode one first started. And I think that's going to be very instrumental, which is the realization that you could start working on something. And then once you start working on something, you can make it better. And by making it better, you start thinking about different things like, am I being aware of what I'm doing? Am I being more efficient in what I'm doing? Am I having conversations around what I'm doing? And it just starts allowing you to get better over time. The last thing I wanted to just very quickly talk about, Camille, is we talked about the curiosity and proactive research. I also want to talk about giving yourself some time to reflect. And, the reflection piece is big, because more often than not, people are not able to figure out what's going right and what's going wrong, and what they could do better and what they could stray away from, because they're simply not giving themselves the time to reflect. And I think a lot about one of my habits. I never realized that there was any benefit around this, but one of the things that I've become a big fan of is really getting a lot of my work done in going to lounges, like shisha lounges and different places where I can sit down and have my own time and listen to some music and just work away on stuff. But what I didn't realize that was also accidentally happening is that every single time I would go to one of these lounges, I was giving myself like 3 hours of alone time. And in those 3 hours of alone time, my mind just drifts and it latches on to whatever's top of mind. It could be like, oh yeah, Kanye West album, let's go listen to it. Or it could be like, I have this thing on Monday, let's talk about it. Or man, Camille and I had a great conversation, let me reflect on it. And what gets really, really fun is that number one, your mind starts like organizing the floating data into more concrete way of thinking, which when you have more concrete way of thinking, you have better conclusions. When you have better conclusions, you can actually do something about it. And I think that sometimes is a requirement, is the amount of alone time that you need to give you. Now, for some people, that would be maybe meditating. For some people, that may be journaling. For some people, that may be even going to the gym and like their mind drifts while they're working out. But having that alone time as an introvert and as I'm speaking to a fellow introvert, I think we get a lot of that instant benefit because of the fact that we're a bit more introspective and we do give ourselves the time to be introspective. But are there ways that you think, and is this universal for even extroverts? Do you think this is something that you see that other people should also invest? And what are the things that you do that gives you that time to reflect in a very safe space that doesn't require you to like rely on the world not being busy, rely on your cell phone not going off? How do you give yourself that time to reflect?
I think I do. The research does support, for instance, I read a lot about learning and how to learn and all of that. And what it shows is like, especially if you do an intense intellectual task, the best thing you can do for yourself are a couple things. And one of them is actually do nothing. So that can be through meditation or it can be through exercise. You can engage the right side of your brain, which is the associated with the creative aspects and domain of yourself. And how you do that is through mindless tasks and not distracting yourself with the task in general. But meditation is the best way. Even taking a nap is another one. There is research to show that even not sleeping but having your eyes closed and just laying there does help with interweaving these ideas you have. And whether that is in the sense of actually focused learning, like studying, or when it comes to actually being reflective on what happened throughout the day, just giving yourself that space is good enough. I think a lot of people nowadays are walking. And what I used to do is I used to walk with headphones and listen to music. And I stopped doing that. So when I go on walks, I have nothing on and I just let myself drift. In modern day society, unfortunately, we have the tendency to, as soon as we're done something, we check our phones and we move on to the next thing while we're on our phone. So we're constantly engaged and distracted onto something. The best thing to do is just to let it sit, like to take a short break, and actually let yourself process those feelings. And you'll find, especially if you're the type of person that has trouble falling asleep at night, if you implement that, that actually does help a lot. So for me though, the things that do help are walking without music, even just sitting down after I'm done something, or just doing nothing, closing my eyes, uh, or any sort of physical activity. Those are all things I do just to be able to reflect.
Yeah, the idea of implementing napping and walking, I think, are two very, very well put ideas. I haven't considered the napping component, but you're right. Like it's the thoughts that put you to sleep or keep you up at night. There's a lot of ideas there as well, which I think is worth addressing. It's interesting you talk about the walking one. I put on the audiobooks when I'm walking, and in many ways, even though there's information coming into my ears, I'm still reflecting and thinking about how that matters to my life at the same time. So there's a little bit there as well. But I think that that's a great encouragement for the listeners is first and foremost to like really pay attention to the internals, mixed with tasting and curiosity. It could really go a long way with figuring out things like what is your passion, what drives you, what is your strengths, what is your weakness, what are things that you're maybe doing for the wrong reasons, and are there other ways to achieve that purpose? What are your core beliefs and what can you implement into your life that will allow you to figure out what those core beliefs are. And I think there's so much density in this episode that is worth re-listening to. And without a doubt, Camille, I will be re-listening to it because even that part about de-escalating situations and the conversation that you have with yourself might be the one of the most important takeaways for me in this episode. I'm very excited to hear what else matters to the listeners. As we wrap up the episode, I want to give you an opportunity to maybe share some final thoughts about the idea of awareness. Why is it that important to a point that we made it an entire chapter to you, Camille? And what is a recommendation? And you could repeat a lot of things we said. I imagine that there may be overlaps, but what are your recommendations for someone that is maybe in an unhappy place or in the world of discovery that haven't quite figured out? Where should they start?
Yeah, well, thank you, and I think you put it very eloquently. The steps that they can take to achieve better awareness, and I think I can just discuss why it's important because without that, you're essentially walking around unconsciously, or you're sleepwalking, and eventually you're going to find yourself repeating the same things and going through the motions, as they say, and wondering why aren't you getting the things that you want to get? Why is life not working out for you in the way that you want? And if you want more, why is it not happening? And that all stems from being aware of what you want and being aware of why aren't you getting it. That is an important question to discover why you're unhappy in the first place. So, like you said, having that space and learning about how to be aware with yourself and what you're feeling is important because if you can be aware of how you're feeling, especially if it's getting worse before it gets at its absolute worst, then you saved yourself from hell. Instead of going through all the suffering, you can just end it right there and you can change things. And that's the most important thing is that you control what you want to be or who you want to be and how you get there with the behaviors. And that comes from reacting to how you feel. And just by sitting with these emotions, you can achieve that. So in my life, it is the reason why I'm able to be here today and not be absolutely miserable. So I can't stress the importance of awareness enough. And self-awareness in general just allows me to achieve more and to be better at 1% every day.
You said it so well, Camille. And as I mentioned, in the last year and a half, I've discovered more about myself than I have in the last 33 years. And that wouldn't have been possible if I didn't finally face myself. And I mean, literally face myself. I looked myself in the mirror and realized there was a lot of things I needed to move around. And having that first conversation, I couldn't be more grateful. And there is nothing more painful than having to do that at a level of rock bottom. And I encourage and I implore everyone listening that even if you're in a place that feels comfortable or maybe even in a thriving type environment, give yourself some practices of self-awareness so that you're more intentional because it's a lot easier to feel good when you know that you're in control over that day being good rather than the fact that it's happening by accident. Camille, as my co-host, uh, would rather do it wouldn't rather do it with anyone else, man. It's an absolute pleasure jamming with you every single week. We have just completed chapter 5 of one of my what I consider to be one of the most incredible initiatives that I think I've ever been part of. Thanks again for joining me for another epic week, man, and I can't wait to jam with you again next week.
Me too.